terms of the suitability of the 12-minute Cooper's run test, it's not the most suitable test to measure aerobic capacity compared to some of the gold standard tests like gas analysis or the multi-stage fitness tests. However, which are more accurate, these tests can be very time consuming to implement and very unpractical with a larger sample of people, but they require special environments like labs and specialised equipment that can be very expensive, which I didn't have access to due to the current restrictions. So I decided to use the 12-minute Cooper's run test to look at the participants' aerobic capacity. This test can also be an indirect measure of a participant's aerobic capacity, and particularly VO2 max, because it relies on a lot of participant motivation to run consistently for 12 minutes, and their honesty as well when recording the number of meters that they ran. Whereas the gold standard test requires an element of motivation, but by measuring different physiological levels like heart rate and lactate levels, it can actually show the participant working at their maximum aerobic capacity, so it can be much more reliable than just relying on their honesty. So it actually gives figures and can actually show evidence of them working at their aerobic capacity, which the 12-minute Cooper's run test fails to do. However, this test is practical due to a lack of equipment. It only required cones, a stopwatch to administer the test, and an adequate amount of space, which was quite limited for me in terms of equipment and space, so I had to make the most of the situation, but I was still able to conduct it in a scientific and meticulous way. Although the test is submaximal compared to something like the Wingate, or gas analysis, which actually increases in intensity, as we said, it can still be quite demanding on fitness levels, especially if some individuals prefer long distance running than others and are much more capable of doing that. However, as we said, it lacks internal validity because the extraneous variables to establish cause and effect can actually inhibit that, and due to the environmental conditions, as we've said. So that's why I would have preferred to have done the gas analysis test, because it's in more of a controlled environment and it has high ecological validity because it can be generalised to more different audiences as well. Adding on to the low reliability, this is because there is human error when measuring the 20 metres. Perhaps they've over-measured or under-measured, so the participants are running more or less. So the standardisation is compromised, whereas with the gold standard test, it's standardised procedure every time, so the results are consistent and the same conditions are being controlled for. So, however, when you do the test retest, this can be limited as well if you don't use the same environment and same conditions when you retest it. So test retest can be low if it's not carried out in the standardised way. This is justification continued. So in terms of power, I chose the standing vertical jump. The reason why I chose this test over other tests was because it's quite suitable for the situation that we're currently experiencing, because it does actually measure lower body power, which is relevant to a footballer, like my client who has aspirations to be a footballer and enjoys playing football. This is because maximum power is needed to be generated, for example, when kicking the ball in penalties, free kicks, and even passing as well. You need to have maximum power depending on the distance that you're passing to, whether it's quite a long distance or over a more shorter distance. In terms of practicality, this test can be adapted to be conducted anywhere with modified equipment. So, for example, you can use the vertical jump mat, which has the tape measure where you put it around the client's waist and it measures it that way. So that gets rid of the fact of subjective and human error. Whereas if you don't have the more scientific, expensive equipment, you can use a tape measure, which is what I did, and the participant holding a pen to make a mark on the wall and then to measure that. So It can be practical because it can be sort of adapted to the environment where it's being conducted. However, in terms of reliability, as we've said, it can be subject to human error, and this can compromise the reliability. Due to reading measurements from the measuring tape, this could affect the overall accuracy of the scores. And it's also, the overall reliability is compromised because this can be affected because different testers will use different ways to conduct the test in terms of the type of jump the participants can use, so if they can use a counter movement or whether they're not allowed to use a counter movement. So this can affect the consistency of the results, so it decreases the reliability. Also, when you retest the reliability, you have to make sure that you're doing it in the exact same way and the exact same environment, and sometimes this isn't always available, so that can be compromised as well due to the environment and lack of equipment. Whereas with more gold standard tests, for example the Wingate test, standardised procedures because it occurs in a lab, so the same equipment's used in the same way every time, so the consistency is there to provide a measurement of overall power, so it increases the reliability of measurement for power. In terms of the validity, the vertical jump, however, is an indirect measure of power which will compromise the validity. This is because it only measures lower body power, specifically those generated in the leg muscles. So this has low internal validity, but it does have high validity as it provides a measure of anaerobic explosive lower body power. So it has strengths and benefits in both areas. However, the reason why it has low internal validity is because the extraneous variables are not being controlled for, and this will compromise the overall accuracy of the results compared to more gold standard tests like the Wingate, which has these controlled conditions which decrease the risk of extraneous variables, but it does have high ecological validity. As we've said, it can be practical and adapted to the environment. It is a maximal activity, but it doesn't really require much participant motivation, which is good. It doesn't really have a physical, psychological effect on them, whereas the Wingate would, and it does have side effects, so that's something. But also the vertical jump is very accessible and very inexpensive. You sort of can adapt it to suit your environment, and it can be adapted and still achieve a scientific result. In terms of muscular strength, I used the sit-up test. And in terms of suitability of this test is because it measures endurance in the abdominals, which is a weakness because it's not measuring overall muscular endurance. This test only measures endurance in the abdominals and hip flexors. So if I was to do this again, or if I was not in this situation, I would have used the 1 rep max test. This is because this test has high validity and is a direct measure of the muscular strength, overall muscular strength, whereas this test is an indirect test, only measuring certain muscular groups. But it had high practicality because, obviously due to lack of equipment and situation, it was the most efficient to administer the sit-up test because of the space restrictions and limited equipment, whereas the 1 repetition max potentially requires you to go to a gym-like environment and use the equipment with weights to accurately test the 1 rep max of the individual. And obviously this wasn't possible at the current time, so I had to make use of this test. In terms of reliability, the sit-up test is a great test for abdominal endurance, which has high reliability. Has high retest reliability with other researchers for abdominal endurance, but not overall. It had high retest of 0.98 correlation coefficient, which is very, very high, but in order to sustain this reliability you need to make sure that the standardised method needed, and this isn't always the case, so this is why the reliability can be sort of compromised, especially if you're not making sure that they're using the machines are calibrated and they're not using the right weights. In terms of validity, this test is very difficult to determine whether the correct technique is being used, as different people have different opinions on how things should be. For example, how the sit-up should be administered, whereas if you have your hands on your quadriceps or behind your head, or you're not allowed to use your hands at all. So it really depends on what your preference is, but that compromises the standardization of the test. And whether or not you hold their feet to increase the to make sure that they're actually measuring what they're measuring, because if some people perceive that holding the feet actually increases hip flex muscles and not abdominals. So yes, compared to tests like the multi-stage sit-ups, which would have been a much more reliable test to use, I had to use a sit-ups test to measure muscular endurance. So once I administered the tests, I recorded some evidence of me administering the test, explaining it to the client, and the client actually doing the test as well. And that is all in a YouTube playlist, which will be linked in my assignment brief to back up my assignment. So in terms of the data collection of the 6 fitness tests, the 30-metre sprint test over a series of 3 attempts, the participants scored 5.2 seconds in the first test, 5.3 seconds in the second, and 5.5 in the third. So we can see that obviously their performance has deteriorated. This can be due to factors of fatigue, for example. So we took their best score, which was 5.2, but compared to normative data, that actually gave a poor rating compared to the values. The next test, the 12-minute Cooper's run, in a total of 12 minutes, the client actually ran 2,225 metres, and that was their best score. And that was in the above average category compared to normative data. The T-test agility test, their results were 12.6 seconds, which was their best score over a period of 3 trials. And I forgot to mention that their second trial was 12.4 and their third trial was 12.2. Sorry, 12.7 and 12.9. And that rating was poor. The wall squats test, their results were 78 seconds. That was their best score, and that was in the good rating category. The vertical jump over a series of 3 trials. In the first trial, they scored 32.6. In the second trial was 32.1 centimetres, and the third trial 32.3 centimetres, which gave a best score, which we calculated as 32.6, which gave a below average rating. And the sit-up test, the participant managed 20 sit-ups in the 60 seconds, and this rating was average. So we can see that the participant had some strengths and some weaknesses. They had 4 strengths and 2 weaknesses.